has turned out to be quite a cold and snowy evening. I think nothing probably compared to what we will have in a couple of days. So glad to have you all here this evening for what is the first event of our All Who Want to Serve portion of the next sequence of the Marshall Legacy series. As Army Chief of Staff, General George C. Marshall had many concerns. How his army would fight, with what that army would fight with, and who that army would be comprised of. And as the demands of a global war made themselves felt, exactly who that army could be comprised of. And by 1945, the United States Army counted some 8 million men and women in uniform. And women in particular found Marshall's constant support during World War II, beginning with the formation of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps in 1941 by Act of Congress. Marshall acted deliberately to make this unit a full member of the Army by 1943. And as the Women's Army Corps, he selected Colonel Ovita Culp Hobby to lead it. And Colonel Hobby is one of the 6 individuals profiled in our Hall of Honor upstairs in the entryway to the library. In addition to the Army, women served in support roles in the Navy as waves and in the Army Air Corps as wasps, totaling around 1.2 million women in uniform in all branches of service and all theaters during World War II. You can learn about the significant service of women during World War II in our exhibition, For My Country, For Myself, just through the doors here. Now, our partner for this element, for this sequence of the Marshall Legacy series is the United States Army's Women's Museum, located at Fort Lee in Virginia. And we are very privileged this evening to have with us the director of that museum, Dr. Francoise Bonnell. Dr. Bonnell has worked at the Women's Army Museum since 2006 and been director since 2010. She is responsible for the preservation, the conservation, and the accountability of over 7,000 artifacts and manages one of the largest archival collections on the Army and women in the Army. A subject matter expert in the history of women's contributions to the Army, she provides support to the Army and the Office of the Chief of Public Affairs by providing written materials for annual observances and responding to inquiries. Prior to becoming director, Dr. Bonnell served as the museum's education and training specialist. In 2006, Dr. Bonnell retired from the United States Army Reserve as a lieutenant colonel and has been an adjunct faculty member at several colleges and universities over the past 15 years. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Francoise Bonnell.
Well, it is indeed a pleasure to be here this evening. And I don't have a mic on, so hopefully that won't be too much trouble. As I said, all those years in the Army, I've learned, I think, to project my voice, sometimes a little too loudly, right? Especially for I am here with Amanda Petipelson. She's the education curator, and I sort of say, what does she do? She does a little of everything at the museum. She's an integral part, as all of our staff is, in the preparation of any presentation we do. And she also is an integral part of the planning for the support that we were going to provide for the exhibition that's outside. So again, I thank you very much for being here. The Army Women's Museum is one of the oldest museums in the Army Museum system. It was established in 1955 at Fort McClellan, Alabama. It originated as the Women's Army Corps Museum. And it was moved in 2001 to Fort Lee, where it was renamed the United States Army Women's Museum. And instead of telling the history of 1942 to 1978, the dates of the Women's Army Corps, our history in that museum is now represents 1775 to present. So we always like to say at the Army Women's Museum, if people remember nothing else about the institution, is that it is not only women's history, but it's Army history. And because it's Army history, of course, then it's their nation's history. our nation's history. And so it's a privilege to be here to do this this talk for the Legacy series, because so much of what our Army and what our military has become today is rooted in the legacy of people such as Colonel Javi and, of course, General Marshall as well. So I want to share a little bit of that history and kind of highlight some of those, that is, all who could serve and who were willing to serve. So I titled this actually A Debt to Democracy and a Date with Destiny. And Colonel Veda Javi, she was the first director of the Women's Army Corps, told a group of women who were at Fort Des Moines, Iowa for their first training in 1943. She said, quote, "You have taken off the silk and put on the khaki. You have a debt and a date to democracy and a date with destiny." And so for us, it's our famous quote for the museum and, of course, for the history that we interpret. But we've often thought about, what does that mean? And as we began to think about it, we realized really it has to do with her legacy and also, of course, the legacy of all those who served in World War II. She clearly meant that the young ladies who were in her audience owed their nation their service, as so many, of course, in World War II felt. And that is the defense of democracy. Yet their destination was not necessarily at that time either individual or even known. In fact, Colonel Javi said the date, which will be the date of the establishment of the Women's Army Corps, she said, quote, "It will grow in significance as it fulfills its vital purpose," end quote. So that tells me that there's a little bit unknown out there, and certainly for all of those women who joined the ranks as well. And I have to ask, does anyone think that Colonel Javi, in her wildest dreams, could even imagine the legacy that she and these first women, who are depicted in this picture up here, of the Women's Army Corps, that is the legacy that they would lead? And I use the word lead because they led the Army, as opposed to leaving the legacy. Because in many ways, in understanding what that lead means, it means really that oftentimes they were very much in uncharted waters, just as the military and our Army today are in somewhat uncharted waters with the role of women as well. So her willingness to answer the call, as well as with General George C. Marshall, the use of their special talents, their skills, combined with their vision, and certainly their compassion for the everyday soldier, for which they were both known, had a huge impact on this nation. In fact, an impact far greater than just the time period that they served in uniform in the period of the length of their careers. So I want to share with you a little bit of that history and a part of their legacy. And that legacy actually begins in World War I. The war to end all wars, of course, World War I, provided more than 35,000 American women the opportunity to serve in the military. The majority of these were nurses serving in the Army as well as the Navy Nurse Corps. The U.S. Army, per se, did not sanction the enlistment of women, although leaders such as General Pershing, who of course was the U.S. Commander-in-Chief in France for the United States, recognized the value of the service of other women serving in the British and the French armies, and actually asked the War Department to send over American women with certain types of skills in order to support the American effort. So the Signal Corps, for example, employed some bilingual women telephone operators. They were nicknamed the Hello Girls, some term they didn't really like themselves. While other women worked also for the quartermaster as well as the Ordnance Corps as personnel clerks as well as cooks and bakers. The medical department hired women as physical and occupational therapists, a brand new field at that particular time, as well as dietitians. But there was considerable confusion over what their status was and how would they be classified. Were they limited duty soldiers? Were they contracted? Were they contracted manpower? Were they contracted soldiers? Or what were they? And so there's no question, though, as we look back, that the service of these women during World War I would help propel the passage of the 19th Amendment in June of 1919, granting the right of every citizen, including women, the right to vote. Yet, at the end of the war, these women, very courageous women for that part, were unceremoniously sent home. In fact, they had no recognition or veterans compensation. That would not be provided to them until 1977, when they were finally recognized. And of course, most of them by then had passed away. Nonetheless, over 20 years later, with the rumblings of World War II on the horizon, Congresswoman Edith North Rogers of Massachusetts who ironically enough was a young spouse of a military attaché at the embassy in Paris in 1919, met many of these women coming back from World War I. And she saw the challenges that they faced and the benefits that they lacked. And it's at that point that she declared, quote, "I was resolved that our women would not again serve with the Army without the same protection the men got." And so it became her mission as the rumblings of war came along. And so in May 1941, Congresswoman Rogers introduced a bill for the creation of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. And although her purpose had been to obtain pay as well as benefits and protection for women serving with the military, the Army wasn't quite ready to accept women directly into its ranks. And so there had to be some compromises made on the floor of the Senate and the House in order to get a bill passed through Congress. In fact, there were many congressmen on one side of the aisle calling the bill, quote, "the silliest piece of legislation ever seen," end quote. And in fact, some went so far as to ask questions such as, and this is a quote, "Who will then do the cooking, the washing, the mending, the humble homey tasks to which every woman has devoted herself? And who will nurture the children?" End quote. And of course, we laugh today, but these are very much concerns of that particular time period. And some, of course, continue today as well. But on the other side, there were those who were claiming, "Let's get rid of all this flag-waving baloney," they said. "Don't you know that we can't win this war without the women?" And so this set the stage for a very heated battle. In fact, this acrimonious debate filled 98 columns in the Congressional Record, which is quite lengthy when you think about what goes into congressional records today. So while Rogers originally had introduced the bill in Congress in May of 1941, it really did fail to receive any kind of serious consideration until after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941. And so with the support of General George C. Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff at the time, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was established to work with the Army. And, quote, "for the purpose of making available to the national defense the knowledge, skill, and special training of women in the nation." So even though the bill didn't cover everything that Congresswoman Rogers had hoped and desired, it did fulfill many of her goals. And so that bill was signed into law by President Roosevelt in May of 1942. This very same day, Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson appointed Oveta Klaub-Hobby as the director of the WWII. In fact, she's in this picture being sworn in here. Evidently, they had to swear her in several times because the press was so enormous. The Corps in the room was so small, they had to rotate them in as they kept raising their hands. And this is one of those many photos here as well. But she was really the perfect choice for many reasons. She had served as the chief of the Women's Interest Section in the Public Relations Bureau at the War Department, so she was very familiar already in the environment in which she would be working. And she had also helped shepherd that WWII bill through Congress. She was a highly qualified candidate with 10 years of experience as the editor of the Houston newspaper. She was the wife of a former Texas governor, William P. Hobby, and is parliamentarian of the Texas State Legislature. She was the perfect choice as a director in that she had a proven record of achievement, but also she had quite an amount of femininity and grace, and that would appeal to small town and middle-class America. General Marshall knew very well of her qualifications and urged her to take the job as a director. But she actually was quite reluctant at first to do that. But because she believed strongly in the idea behind the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, she accepted the appointment. And she stated that every auxiliary who enlisted in the Corps would be trained in a non-combatant military job and thus, quote, "free a man to fight," end quote. And that is the famous rallying cry for women across the military in World War II. In this way, American women could make an individual and significant contribution to the war effort. And her sincerity aided in her presenting this concept to the public because she believed so fiercely in it. And in frequent public speeches, she explained, "The gaps our women fill are in those non-combatant jobs where women's hands and women's hearts fit naturally. WWICs will do the same type of work which women do in civilian life. They will bear the same relationship to the men in the Army, and they bear to the men of the civilian organizations in which they currently work." And so in Hobby's view, WWICs were to help the Army win the war, just as women had always helped men achieve success in the past, in war as well as in peacetime. So the first work at hand was to begin the recruiting drive and establishing the centers for the initial WWIC candidates. The initial class of 440 officer training candidates walked through the doors on July 20th in 1942 at Fort Des Moines, Iowa. The applicants had to be U.S. citizens. They had to be between the ages of 21 and 45. They had to be single, that is, with no dependents. They had to be a minimum of 5 feet tall and had to weigh more than 100 pounds. Not even imagine. Amazingly, actually, the applicant pool had exceeded 35,000 women in a very short order. The first candidates were, on average, 25-year-old graduates who had worked either as office administrators, executive secretaries, or teachers. And it's estimated that 1 out of every 5 had enlisted because a male member of her family was in the armed forces, and she wanted to help him get home sooner. And as we explored a little bit more as to the reasons why women serve, we found several who were combat widows of Pearl Harbor and Bataan. One woman enlisted because her son, who was of fighting age, had been injured in an automobile accident and he couldn't fight. And so she took his place in order to serve. And another joined because there were no men of fighting age in her family. And so all of these women really professed a desire to aid their country in a time of need. Well, a month later, the first auxiliary, or enlisted WWII class, started its 4-week basic training at Fort Des Moines. They occupied the old cavalry barracks, for which they remarked that they were pretty poor shape, but managed very quickly to bring them up to speed to their standards, as women, of course, we would say do. They were slightly younger than the officer candidates, these first auxiliaries. They had high school educations and less work experience, but they possessed the same desire and motivation to help America win the war. Both the officers and the auxiliaries in the first classes were trained by male regular Army officers, and they were commanded by Colonel Don C. Faith, who himself was a cavalryman, an infantryman before that. Faith was well suited for this position due to his background. He was both an educator and he had a distinct interest in the psychology of military education. He was a very open-minded man, is the way he was reflected at the time. Gradually, the WWII officers would take over the training themselves, and they would train the rest of the Corps. And with each graduating class, WWICs were then sent off into the field. So although women in key leadership roles, both within and outside the government, realized that American women were indeed capable of contributing substantially to the war effort, but they accepted the prevailing stereotypes which portrayed women as best suited for tasks which demanded precision, repetition, and attention to detail. So these factors, coupled with a post-depression fear that women in uniform might take jobs from civilians, there was very limited initially in the range of employment for the first wave of women in the Army. Thus, originally, women were able to serve basically in 4 career fields, and they're represented here in this photo: the administration, fields administration, driving, cooking and baking, and clerical work. Clearly legacies themselves of World War I. But once their skills and capabilities were realized, the services began to expand WWIC positions to include weather observers, cryptographers, radio repairmen, sheet metal workers, parachute riggers, and even bomb site maintenance specialists. And this is only a few of the over 400 specialties that were open to women in the following year. So while the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps is experiencing unqualified success, due to the restrictions, though, the Army had more requests for auxiliaries than it could process. In fact, General Marshall went on a visit to General Eisenhower's headquarters, who had been so impressed with the capabilities of women in uniform. In fact, said in many cases, a woman in uniform could actually replace 2 men to do the same work. He promised him, imagine that, he promised him that he would increase the number of WWIC authorizations when he returned to Washington. So it was really necessary for the Corps to repeal the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps bill, and within 9 months they had created instead the Women's Army Corps. Of course, this was supposed to last for the duration of the war plus 6 months, but it would become a component of the Army. Women were afforded pay, privileges, protection equivalent to their male counterparts. And the status that Congresswoman Rogers had originally sought in 1941 for Army women was finally achieved 2 years later in 1943. But the concept of women in uniform was difficult for American society of the 1940s to accept. In fact, in 1939, an Army staff study which addressed the probability that women would serve in some capacity with the Army, a male officer wrote that, quote, women's probable jobs would include those of hostess, librarians, canteen clerks, cooks and waitresses, chauffeurs, messengers, and strolling minstrels. Again, a legacy really of World War I, not to be unexpected. But no mention was made in this report of the highly skilled office jobs which the majority of the WWICs eventually held, because such positions often carried with them significant responsibility, and many people doubted that women were capable of handling such jobs. In many ways, a fundamental change in the view of women's roles in American society was bound to occur. And with such far-reaching notions as putting hundreds of thousands of women to work in war production factories and by putting them in military uniforms, they would be virtually everywhere. And this was reflected in everyday political cartoons. At the museum, we have a very rich collection. And actually, I'm showing you two of them here, which I wanted to share with you. And we use these two in a lot of the 11,000, 12,000 soldiers in our educational programs. And so I'll give you a moment here just to look at them. In fact, the one on the right has a woman in uniform bending down to Jerome, I think is his name, right? And he's saying, let's get married, or she's saying, let's get married, Jerome. I'll be a better soldier knowing I have someone to fight for. A complete role reversal here. In fact, when we talk to soldiers, both old and young and old, it's inconceivable, really, that kind of role reversal would be so exciting. I mean, after all, if you have eHarmony.com and Match.com, it's a like or not a like. It doesn't matter who's doing the liking or not liking. The one on the left, so this has a detachment, a uniform of WWII walking down the road, and it has a formation of GIs, that is soldiers walking down the other side. And if you kind of look closely at what's happening here, you might be able to remark that the men's heads are turned to the women and the women's heads are turned to the men. Of course, you have the lofty sergeant up front, both male and female, marching right along, ignoring what's happening behind them. There's some subliminal messages. In fact, you might see it up there in the left-hand corner. Hotel. Yeah. So, and I think, yeah, it says hotel. And I think when we talk with, again, soldiers in the programs that we do, and we show them this particular cartoon, they chuckle because a lot of them will say, well, not much has changed, I guess, right? But it really shows sort of the dichotomy. But overcoming the slander and the conservative reaction by many Americans, which was a phenomenon shared by both the British and the Canadian sisters in uniform who had been serving, drafted for in the case of the British, for many, many years, women persisted in their work, and they did significantly contribute to the war effort. And so the 1943 transition from the auxiliary status to the Women's Army Corps was really a de facto recognition of this valuable service. And ultimately, more than 150,000 American women served in uniform in the Army during World War II, with about 250,000 in all their branches. So, much thought was given, though, to the question of who should be allowed to serve and in what capacity. However, the social norms at the time created challenges to expanding service beyond that of white Americans. Nevertheless, the position of President Roosevelt and the support of his general staff, as well as the people such as General Marshall, prevailed. And they argued that all who would want to serve should be allowed to serve. And in a letter dated February 1st, 1943, written from the President to the Honorable Henry L. Stimson, the Secretary of War, Roosevelt stated, quote, "No loyal citizen of the United States should be denied the democratic right to exercise the responsibilities of his citizenship, regardless of his ancestry." And he continued on by stating that, quote, "I am glad to observe all are collaborating in a program which will ensure the opportunity for all loyal Americans to serve their country at a time when the fullest and wisest use of our manpower is an all-important to the war effort." So this policy really, and this approach, opened the door to millions of Americans to serve who otherwise perhaps would not have had that opportunity. And that service provided opportunities, of course, that would forever change our nation's history. And in the experience of the Women's Army Corps, we see influential women shaping the course of that history. In fact, before the passage of the WWII legislation in 1942, establishing the Auxiliary Corps, the United States War Department had announced that a new WWII policy would follow that would allow for the admission of black women into the Women's Army Corps. And a quota system was put in place, dictating that only 2% of the Army could be women, a quota that lasted well into the 1960s, and out of that 2%, only 10% could be African Americans. And the women who had joined, who were part of that 10%, nicknamed themselves the 10%ers. Well, the Army argued that really it could not undertake a program of major social change, such as desegregation, in a time of war. And we see this repeatedly over the course of the history of the military and society. But it did mandate that blacks and whites would begin training together in the officer candidate school beginning in 1942 and in specialist and technical schools beginning in 1943. Thus, 40 of the first 440 women that attended officer candidate school in Fort Des Moines, Iowa in 1942, as you can see in this photo, were black. In fact, this is one company of the larger number, but those 40 women of the 440 are on the left-hand side. And this class and this particular photo are filled with more famous women who will go on to do amazing things in the Army and after the Army. And these women, many who were handpicked by the civil rights leaders Mary McLeod Bethune, who's in the upper right-hand corner, and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, went on to shape and lead the Black WAC forces in World War II. So what I'd like to do is share with you a short history of 4 distinct groups of Americans who really embraced this opportunity to serve. And the first is that of African Americans. And so this sort of leads from the previous conversation. Well, pictured here are 3 groups of men. The first are perhaps most familiar to you all, and of course that's the Tuskegee Airmen of the 332nd Fighter Group of the 15th Air Force, who I understand will be speaking here. Somebody will be speaking here soon, in the near future. Of course, they flew ground missions as well as escorted bombers. The second group, which is actually in the further right-hand corner, are the thousands of men who kept the Red Ball Express rolling, and they carried hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies to the First and Third Armies as they raced through France. And the third group, in the middle there, is of the 761st Tank Battalion that fought with Patton's Third Army. In fact, they spent over 180 days in combat and captured dozens of towns in France and Belgium. In fact, in total, in World War II, over 1.5 million African Americans served in uniform throughout Europe, the Pacific, and the continental United States. But perhaps one group may be slightly less familiar to you, and that's of the first African American WACs who served as well. In fact, the first group of African American women to enter the WAC were a distinguished group. They were urged to join the WAC by organizations such as the NAACP. In fact, the letter on the left, hard to read, states, in the upper left-hand corner, pointing to the slackening of the policy of segregation of the WAC training center at Fort Des Moines, Iowa. It really indicates that the NAACP clearly saw this as an opportunity, that is, the entrance of women, African American women, into the WAC as a way to put a wedge in racial segregation. And of course, we will see this after the war. Many African American communities also had become aware of what was called the Double V campaign. So victory abroad and victory at home. And really the idea being that the service of blacks in the military, in combat, during the war, could change racial policies in the future. And so many African American women who were part of this first group to join were then sent into positions of greater responsibility. In fact, we have several fascinating collections of some of these women. One, for example, is that of Harriet West. She was assigned to the Personnel Division in Washington, D.C., and she was specifically to oversee the minority needs. And she went from installation to installation, recording meticulously in her notes as to what the situation was for African American women, both positive as well as negative. She worked directly for the WAC director, Colonel Javi, and eventually she would go on to serve as a recruiter and an inspector for race relations for black women in the Army. Another of these women was Charity Adams. Perhaps you might have heard of her in the more recent last couple of years. She was handpicked to command the 68th 88th Postal Battalion, the only black WAC unit sent overseas to serve in Europe. In fact, there was a policy that banned black WAC units from serving anywhere except in the United States, in the continental United States. But in spite of the prejudicial policies and inequalities, over 6,500 black WACs served loyally, and of course with great distinction. They followed the call of Mary McLeod Bethune because they had acknowledged what she had said is that this is America's war and we too are Americans. And so many of these women, have we found out by studying them and their history in the museum, they've actually go on to use their GI Bills to obtain higher degrees, and some, such as W. Roundtree Johnson, would in fact become civil rights leaders in the decades following the war. So the second group I'd like to share with you is that of those from Hispanic heritage who served. And so actually these are 2 photographs. Don't know if you're familiar with them, but perhaps more famous of Hispanic and Latino men who served. The 588th Regimental Combat Team, it had the largest percentage of both Latino as well as Native Americans, and they fought in New Guinea and the Philippines. In fact, they so impressed General MacArthur, he was quoted as saying that they were the greatest fighting combat team ever deployed in battle. That's how impressive they were. The 65th Infantry Regiment from Puerto Rico were sent overseas as well in 1944. They participated and fought in the campaigns of Rome-Arno, the Rhineland, Ardennes-Alsace, and of course the rest of Central Europe. In fact, Latino soldiers from the 36th Infantry Division from Texas were among the first soldiers to land on Italian soil and suffered extremely heavy casualties. And in total, over 500,000 Hispanics and Latinos served during World War II. So a group, of course, that's going to be a little bit less familiar and certainly newer to us is that of the Hispanic and Latino WWIIs who served as well. In fact, there are numerous women among this pioneering group. In fact, one special company was formed in Puerto Rico. In fact, a WWII recruiting campaign on the island in the fall of 1944 resulted in 200 women being selected out of a pool of 1,500 for service in the WWII. The entrance requirements were very rigorous. In fact, each woman was required to pass the test in English. And those that selected represented many professions: teachers, office workers, translators, and even a lawyer. The majority of these Puerto Rican WWIIs assembled into a unit. They were flown to Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia for basic training. There they also received very specialized training as clerks and then were assigned to the Army Embarkation Post Office that was located on Lexington Avenue in Manhattan, New York. In fact, you can see them here on the left side on the picture arriving at the port. When interviewed, these women emphatically voiced the pride they felt in serving and wearing a uniform. But they noted two things. One, that they were neither accustomed to wearing wool, that was a novelty to them, nor were they accustomed to the idea of segregation. In fact, several of the darker complexioned women were separated and sent to Fort Des Moines, Iowa to receive basic training with African-American WWIIs. Of course, they did not understand why. But nonetheless, their contributions to the war effort were tremendous. And like their African-American counterparts, some of these first Hispanic servicewomen went on to work with the League of United Latin American Citizens to fight for civil rights over the next decades. In fact, our education staff put together a video, which is playing out here in the exhibition area. And when we posted it on our Facebook page, we were astounded that it had been seen and liked by tens of thousands of people. And so in a way, it almost by itself went viral. And we're very proud of that, thanks to Ms. Petipelson behind me. But what was interesting is many families shared those histories, and there were so many more who were absolutely astounded at what they had learned, and in fact learned about their own family's legacy in terms of their service through these 200 WWIIs from Puerto Rico. So the third group is that of Native American heritage. The most well-known group of Native Americans is that of the Navajo Code Talkers, which probably, thanks to Hollywood, are you familiar with, thankfully. I say that appreciatively. So, of course, they use their language as a battlefield code the Japanese never broke. In fact, many men from various tribes, such as the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chippewa, the Creek, they served with great distinction. In fact, over 80,000, which is almost 20% of the total U.S. population of Native Americans served in World War II, which is pretty astounding. Much less is known about the Native American women and their service in World War II. And we've looked hard, and we've looked everywhere. But recently we found a wonderful story about a young lady who came from a Pueblo tribe. In fact, her story is a great example of that idea that women were brought into the Army with specific skills, and they were encouraged then to use them. Her name was Ava Maribel, and she joined the WWII in 1943. She's here on the right-hand side. Ava was educated at the Santa Fe Indian School, where the influence from her family as well as the teachers and the community led her to pursue her natural ability to paint. And as a student at the studio school, she created many, many murals of everyday Pueblo life and even war bond posters. Her skill as an artist was quickly recognized when she joined the Army, and thus she was designated as an occupational specialty 296, or that of an artist. She was assigned to the Army Air Forces and rose through the ranks very quickly as one of only 2 Army WWII artists in the Army Air Forces. And her duties as an Army artist also led her to create G.I. Gertie, of which there's a strip up here that we've just discovered, a cartoon strip that was featured in WWII publications. This cartoon earned her the distinction of being one of the first Native American female cartoonists. While she was stationed at Patterson Field in Ohio, she assisted with the painting of a 40-foot mural titled A Bridge of Wings inside the Air Technical Service Command headquarters. It was a massive, inspirational depiction of the improving relations between North and South America. and it still stands there today, and it still bears her signature. She used her GI Bill to return to art school after the war. And we were very fortunate to be able to correspond with her son, who shared much more of her story with us. And we continue even, of course, now to look for other Native American women who served in World War II. So the fourth and the last group of Americans to take advantage of these opportunities provided by the Army is that of Japanese Americans. And here we're going to speak of the Nisei, or the second generation men and women. So men of Japanese ancestry served in the military beginning in 1939, and even a little bit sooner than that. In fact, the military sought them out specifically because of their intelligence and language duties. But their service was terminated when President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which granted the War Department the very broad powers to create military exclusion areas in which over 100,000 Japanese Americans would eventually be interned. But nevertheless, due to necessity, as well, of course, as espousing the idea that all loyal citizens should be allowed to serve, the War Department reversed course and began to seek out American men of Japanese descent to establish combat teams, which they're represented here on the left as well. And so as a result, more than 33,000 second-generation Japanese Americans volunteered to serve in the U.S. Army during World War II. Of those, 19,000 served in the 100th Infantry Battalion of the 422nd Regimental Combat Team, and of course in the military intelligence services as well. They proved their loyalty to America and in many cases became some of the most decorated units in World War II. But the other part of the lesser-known story, as you're catching on to my pattern here, is that, of course, of the Nisei women joining the WWII. So we don't know much about these women. In fact, there was a memorandum that was written in 1943 by the War Department that said, all necessary steps must be taken to prevent publicity regarding intelligence personnel of Japanese extraction serving in the military intelligence service language schools, and that all pictures concerning the aforementioned be classified confidential. So we do not know how many of these pictures of both men and women, of course, are tucked away somewhere in the archives, perhaps with that original. We have a couple of them that have been declassified with that confidential stamp. But that makes it also very difficult without the photographic evidence to really be able to show it. But we do know that in late 1943, the Women's Army Corps began recruiting Nisei women, and in some cases, right out of the internment camps, just as they had with men. They faced great resistance, though, that is the WWII recruiting teams, in part because of the fact that they were requiring these young ladies to sign loyalty oaths, which many, of course, found to be an insult, as did their male counterparts. And in fact, their parents were afraid for them to leave their family behind. And so that made it that much more difficult. But nevertheless, several hundred were selected, and a number of these were training in linguistics at the Military Intelligence Service Language School at Fort Snelling, Minnesota. And by 1944, Nisei women were specifically selected to replace the enlisted graduates of that school so that they too could free a man to fight. In this case, their Nisei brothers. The other Nisei WWICs received more traditional training in clerical, medical, and supply positions. Eventually, some WWICs found themselves serving as translators and office workers at General MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo. There's no known exact number of Nisei women who served. And of course, this is an area that we continue to research. In fact, we've been working with Smithsonian very closely to examine artifacts and archival materials on the topic in a partnership to try to be able to better interpret the history. So these are all examples of all who want to serve. And they are the shared legacy of Colonel Javi and General Marshall while they were in uniform. But arguably, there are many more legacies over the next 8 decades that will fall that are directly attributed to these two individuals from World War II. So I want to share these with you. And the first of the two pertains to major policy changes that took place in 1948 after the end of World War II. In June 1948, President Truman signed into law the Women Armed Services Integration Act that established the Women's Army Corps as a permanent part of the Army. Right? Because the WWII in World War II was to last for the duration of the war plus 6 months. This made it permanent. Of course, we know how permanent that had become a little bit later. 1 month later, in July 1948, Truman issued Executive Order 9981, mandating an end to racial discrimination and segregation in the armed forces. In fact, in this order, Truman states, there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. And of course, today we know there's the topic of gender was left out, of course, left for the Women's Armed Service Integration Act. So these two independent policies are based on the ideals of equality and opportunity. And in fact, they come to be realized at Camp Lee, Virginia, just a few short months later. So the second part of this legacy is the establishment of the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Service, which was established in 1951 by General Marshall. And the purpose here, of course, was to create a committee, large number of women, mostly out of uniform, who would be able to advise advise the government in general what some of the challenges, issues, as well as make recommendations on how to better utilize and improve the experiences of women in the military. In fact, I went back and read from 1961 to literally present each of the year's annual recommendations that were made, and some of the profound changes that were made in the 1970s that provided equal benefits, basically, to women as well as opportunity came from the women of Dakowitz. And still, of course, today, still Dakowitz serves in the same capacity. So the third legacy is that of the gender integration of the Army. And of course, now we have to speak of the first part of the gender integration of the Army, as I am reminded by my infantry brethren. And that is really, it came about with the disestablishment of the Women's Army Corps in 1978. On the left-hand side is the order disestablishing the Women's Army Corps. And on the right-hand side is a picture of the last director of the Women's Army Corps, the first female Major General Clark, who was also the first first female commander of an installation at Fort McClellan, Alabama. And she is there with her first sergeant, Helen Johnston, casing the colors of the WWII, of the Women's Army Corps. And as we look back and we reflect back, in many ways it's a momentous occasion, and it is truly a part of the legacy of the WWII from World War II, as well as the 30 years prior to that. And for many, it was a very exciting day. In fact, many women who served in the WWII in the late 1970s never really realized they were in the WWII, because the Army had already started that process in the early 1970s towards gender integration. But for many, including Command Sergeant Major Helen Johnston there, it was a sad day, because many believed that what they had actually achieved up to that point would then be lost when the playing field literally became even, and much of what they had accomplished would then be set back. Of course, we know that now, perhaps not to be completely true in that sense. So the final legacy, of course, that's being written right now, I think begins really with the rescinding of the combat exclusion policy in 2013. So this is a picture of then Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta with then Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dempsey. And they are rescinding the policy that was established in 1994 at the end of the first Gulf War, that was designed to ensure that the values and the morals of America, through our representation in the government, would in fact protect women from all of those things seemingly that might be negative because of direct combat. And it's a complicated exclusion policy, but nonetheless, it prevented women from being in certain jobs and in certain positions and certain types of work. In 2001, of course, with the advent of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, that policy became obsolete pretty quickly, in part because of the nature of that battlefield. It just couldn't be supported. And so when this policy, exclusion policy, was rescinded in 2013, it really opened the door for a discussion about what should the role of women be in the military. Should all the doors be open? Should they be allowed to achieve the highest levels within our military structure? And should they be afforded the opportunities of their male counterparts? And what's interesting about this is that so many of these discussions and questions are clearly tied back to what those discussions were in 1942, in 1948, and 1978. Again, legacies of Colonel Javi as well as General Marshall. And so if we were to go all the way back to that first phrase, a debt to democracy, or a debt to democracy and a date with destiny, I wonder if that date with destiny has not yet been achieved. We haven't yet had that date with destiny, because we really don't know what the future holds and how far this legacy is going to continue based on what those men and women did in uniform in World War II. So, having said all of that, I thank you for your attention. It's kind of a whirlwind tour of the history, but I want to thank you very much again for the opportunity, and would certainly like to answer any questions that anybody might have or something that I talked about.
Oh, quick question. As the war progressed, was the driving force behind increasing women, was it always freeing up men to go fight from jobs that, just more manpower in combat, or was there a parallel recognition that, hey, women are doing this well, we want to advance women? How much was it, increasing combat power, and how much was it in pushing a very good agenda?
Well, I would argue the former. It really was about a manpower shortage. What we have seen in studying the history from 1775 to present is that the changes that come about with the role of women in the military in general come about because of the needs of the nation, the needs of the military itself, first and foremost. And so in that sense, that's what's driving, and you see this all the way through World War II. And there are very, I wouldn't call them lofty ideas, but maybe that's what they are. They're very high ideals about opportunity, but it's always going, as we found in the history, even today, at least up until the last year or so, driven by what that necessity was. We've also seen that social change doesn't happen during war, and that is whether it's racial, gender integration, desegregation, or changes in social changes in social policy. So in that sense, I would say it's that need that's driving that change, or driving what women are doing. Excuse me, seems to have got something in my throat. Any other questions? Yes.
In the Battle of the Bulge, things got terribly desperate, and men who were clerks or cooks and so forth were told to get out in the field and to fight. Did that ever happen to women in a desperate situation like the Bulge?
Not that I'm aware of. We do know, for example, if you take the D-Day invasion, there were 24 nurses who landed on the D-Day beaches on 4 days after the D-Day invasion. And they, of course, were there not only to just set hospitals up, but also to do the triage that their male counterparts either could no longer do because they had been killed, or perhaps because they were trying to move forward with their forces. So, in the fact that were these women actually then going to be replaced by other women because of the situations they were in? No. What we see really is a constant increase in the manpower and the movement of women into previous combat zones and into theaters based on the needs either through the loss or the reassignment of men in those particular units. There's a group of women who were signal operators, and they moved with the 8th and the 12th Air Force, and they moved very quickly literally after the breakout in July of 1944, and they were within miles of the front lines of the headquarters that they served in. But again, they continued to move all the way to Germany with those units, never really replacing per se anybody, but fulfilling jobs that they were able to do. So in that sense, if I answered your question, not to my knowledge, but certainly very close to combat nonetheless, but still as non-combatants. The only thing combatant-like that women carried in World War II were gas masks. And that was, of course, because of the legacy of World War I. But other than that, they did not carry firearms. In fact, oftentimes when they did come into some kind of danger, there were protocols put in place in order to protect them first. So. Okay. Any other questions?
Were any women captured?
Yes. Probably most famously are the nurses of Corregidor. So Army and Navy nurses that served in Corregidor in the Philippines. When the Philippines fell to the Japanese, they of course took the men and most famously marched them across the Bataan Peninsula in the Bataan Death March. What they did with the women, because the Japanese did not believe women could be prisoners of war, because women should not be in the military at all. Anyhow, they treated them as civilian detainees. So they took all those nurses, they put them on ships, took them to another part of the Philippines. In fact, Santo Tomas in the Philippines was a prisoner of war camp. Most of them ended up, and I call it a prisoner of war camp because it was, although of course the Japanese called it a detainee camp. And there they, some cases, like Frances Nash, we know her story well. We have some of her artifacts in the museum. Was in prison for 3.5 years, and eventually, after the Philippines was retaken by General MacArthur, then they were freed. There's only one woman who's taken that we know of as a prisoner of war in Europe after the European continent, the invasion. And she was quickly freed because the Germans didn't know what to do with her. So they just said, go back to your lines. We don't want to work with you. So yes, there were women, numerous women who have been taken prisoner of war in different circumstances. Mm-hmm.
Well, was there a move to have all the women leave the military after World War II? Like, you know, all the Rosie the Riveters that kicked them out of the defense plans. Did they say, okay, you women served during the emergency's over, we don't want you anymore?
I'm so glad you asked that question. That's a great question. No, actually it's kind of ironic because exactly when men left the military, of course, they wanted their jobs back in the factory. So women were expected to go back to the home. But because the men were leaving the military, what did that mean for women? Well, we've come to an understanding, certainly over the last 30 or 40 years, that women often are there in that bridge, that manpower bridge between the shifting changes of the active military in particular and the service of men. And so although the numbers dwindled very quickly because it was for the duration of the war plus 6 months, it was known to a certain extent that some kind of permanent presence, military presence, would be made for women. And so several thousand of them were retained. In fact, that Women's Armed Service Integration Act in 1948 created a permanent WAC, a permanent WAF, which is the Women's Air Force, and of course then the Marines and the Navy, the Waves and the Spars and the Coast Guard were all created permanently, so to speak, if that's the case. And so, no, there really wasn't an expectation. So you actually see a very large increase in the recruiting of women in 1948, 1949, 1950. With the advent of the Korean War, that's going to be the largest call-up for women, focused mostly on Army nurses, but a large number needed in the headquarters that were in the Pacific, supporting the war effort on the Korean Peninsula. And so we see a very large expansion of the number of women. Get to the Vietnam War, of course, there are 800 or 900 women in the WAC, as well as in the Air Force and the Navy who served, as well as the thousands of nurses that did. But at the end of the war, with the advent of the draft, that is the end of the draft in 1973, we see another huge push towards the recruiting of women to fill the void of the men leaving the active duty. And so I'm expanding on the answer to your question because you gave me the opportunity. But it's kind of interesting because, again, it's sort of that idea that when there's a manpower shortage, it's turned to woman power. And of course, women in the military, certainly up to now, don't know what the future will hold, but it has always been a force of volunteers. And so the nature of that relationship in terms of the government's needs and the women willing to serve, they have always gone hand in hand. So in that sense, no, not really an expectation that a lot of women, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, were glad to go home, back. They took advantage of the GI Bill, oftentimes married the GIs that they had fallen in love with during the war, and had hoped to really restart the lives that they had lost when they had joined. So don't get me wrong, there aren't millions wanting to stay in, but certainly a large number that anticipated to do that. Yeah. So. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you.